It is great to have Bob and Cheryl here from St. Louis, and I'll warn any other viewers that when you come from out of town to visit us in church, we want to get a chance to look at you after you've been looking at us through the camera, so you will be a part of the liturgy. We'll get you up here. Also, Bob and Cheryl have already registered to come down for our conference with Bishop John Shelby Spong on August 3rd. Any other viewers, if you would like to contact us about coming to that event, you have to listen to the entire sermon because the email address is at the very end. So those of you that drop out after 5 or 6 minutes, you just won't know, will you? Things are happening so fast these days that I feel almost as if I'm tied in chains because I'm only allowed to preach once a week and I only get to write a column for the newspaper every other week. Most days I am then forced to just sit and shout at the television as I switch from news channel to news channel, changing channels so fast it looks like you're staring right into a strobe light. There are a lot of topics about which I think persons of conscience need to be vigilant right now. With some fear of sounding like a conspiracy theorist, I do have some fear that our economy in North America is now predicated on a perpetual state of war, and that as military spending in Afghanistan and Iraq is diminishing, I'm afraid that the corporate media is punching us up to make us willing to accept a war in either North Korea or in Iran or perhaps both. Further, I have to say that my heart is breaking about the rapid retreat that we are seeing among those who were willing to work for genuine gun law reform in the wake of Sandy Hook, as Americans are once again demonstrating that the most powerful weapon in the NRA's arsenal is how short the attention span is of Americans, that we are willing to give ground so fast after each tragedy that it looks like real reform is now just something to wish for. But on the positive side, we now have 2 cases under consideration by the Supreme Court that many of us who have advocated for gay and lesbian civil rights for generations have worked and prayed to see. I remember taking part in a demonstration on the campus of MSU almost 20 years ago when the then president of MSU resolutely refused to add sexual orientation to the university's non-discrimination policy. And the president refused to come out and talk to us. And so just in I occasionally become inspired. You might think it's angry. It looks the same to some of you. But I was standing under the window of his office, shaking my fist and shouting, "We are in the right. We have already won. You just don't know it yet." Now, that was not a planned statement. It was one of those prophetic moments where it just kind of jumped out of my lungs. And for the past 15 years, there's been relatively little evidence that I was right in saying that we had already won and he just didn't know it yet. Because what progress we've made has come in such little pieces, such little incremental changes. But now 9 states in the United States have made it legal to have same-sex marriage. And that sounds pretty good until you compare it to the fact that it's legal in 23 states to have a sexual relationship with your horse. In America, we are having a hard time getting caught up in matters of sexual reality. Last year, Vice President Joe Biden either very cleverly or very clumsily announced his belief that same-sex marriage should be legal, which then forced our president to get over this silly defense he's had that his views were evolving, and they got to evolve all at once, and President Obama said that he also sided in favor of same-sex marriage. And at that point, the NAACP felt compelled to let go of their long-standing prejudice. And since then, it's been like a domino effect, one event after another, and we suddenly see now the Supreme Court considering 2 cases that a year ago we wouldn't have thought they would have even entertained. The German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer observed 200 years ago that all truth passes through three stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. And third, it is viewed as being self-evident, that we've all always known it. Many of us here have lived through the ridicule, and we've lived through the violent opposition. And now we're seeing the people who fought us for years being willing to say it is now self-evident. Some of our gay members of this church have suffered discrimination in employment. Some of you have been treated horribly by your family members, by fake friends, by mean-spirited peers in school, and by some churches that could be bulldozed and turned into a parking lot, and they would instantaneously be more useful. Thanks. That's two. Are the rest of you sleeping? Some of us who have been your supporters and advocates have also suffered with you. Our advocacy has damaged our careers and strained our relationships. Through my years of advocating for gay rights from the pulpit, I have literally turned hundreds of Christians into Presbyterians and Methodists and Lutherans. Not that there are not gay-friendly Presbyterian, Methodist, and Lutheran congregations in other cities, but our YouTube viewers must remember that this broadcast originates in Springfield, Missouri. And though things are changing here, most mainstream denominations in our community are still entirely safe places in which to hide with your prejudices. A few years ago, Bishop John Shelby Spong announced that he would no longer give an explanation for his support for same-sex relationships because, he said, enough time had passed that everyone should now be aware of the medical, psychological, moral, and biblical issues surrounding this topic, and now it's time to put the ball in the other court so that the people who continue to be prejudiced should have to give a reason why they are still so prejudiced. They are now the ones who must explain their hatred. As we have seen in early testimony before the Supreme Court this week, the argument that tries to defend this prejudice is so shallow, so thin, so unsubstantial that we have clearly arrived at a time where almost everyone is ready to say that these truths are self-evident. Not necessarily self-evident to all 9 of the justices at the same time, and certainly there will be at least 3 of them that will end up voting to uphold DOMA, and maybe even 4. But even if it is 5, even if DOMA is upheld, regardless of the importance that is afforded to them in the media and even in the Constitution, the Supreme Court of the United States doesn't get to determine what is true and what is not true. I would say to them what I have said to MSU's president 15 years ago. We have already won. It's just a matter of them deciding which side of history that they want to be on. Do they want to leave behind them a legacy like George Wallace standing in front of the door of the auditorium at the University of Alabama 50 years ago, blocking the way to integration of the state's university? As Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of time is long, but it bends towards justice. That fact is not always visible because progress is slow. I have for many years in this community been labeled as a radical, and there are not more than 2 or 3 pastors in town that will still be seen with me in a public setting. But what I said 20 years ago that seemed so radical, that there was no religious reason to be prejudiced against gays and lesbians, what I said a decade ago, that our invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq were unfounded and unjust, those things don't seem so radical anymore, do they? Those things seem very mainstream. Mohandas Gandhi said to his family members, never apologize for being correct. Many people, especially ignorant people, want to punish you for speaking the truth, for being correct, for being who you are. Never apologize for being correct or for being ahead of your time. If you're right and you know it, speak your mind. Even if you are a minority of one, the truth is still the truth. On this Easter Sunday, when so many churches are teeming with people who have come to be told once again what my preaching professor at Vanderbilt liked to say, David Buttrick would say, Jesus popped out of the tomb, we all get to live forever, yippee. They want to be told once again that there was a magical half-deity, half-human who died for their sins long before they were born and was raised from the dead, and that means that you don't have to worry about trans fats or staying fit because you're going to live forever in heaven. I invite you who have found your way into this very small crowd in this very tiny church to set aside that self-serving religious message and to think about resurrection in a different way. I do not believe that substitutionary death and a promise of eternal life is what the resurrection meant to the disciples in the mid-first century. And I don't think that line of thinking will find many adherents in the future, though for now it seems radical to many to contradict that line of thinking. Even the people who object to contradicting it don't really believe it. Not many people can invest themselves in that kind of superstition in the 21st century. I believe that Jesus was a preacher of radical compassion who stood up to the religious authorities, who condemned everyone, the religious authorities who were busy condemning everyone who wasn't as pious as they were. And I believe he stood up to the empire that oppressed his people, and he stood up to the economic system that enslaved and impoverished his people, and that his message of defiance and radical compassion got him killed by the empire. And I do not doubt that he was betrayed by members of his own religious community, his own family, his school peers, his synagogue, and don't we all know what that feels like? I believe that the empire killed him to shut him up. I believe that the religious teachers of guilt and piety walked away from his tomb, wiping the dirt off their hands and thinking that they had ended that message. But his followers believed that what he had to say had a life that could not be contained in a tomb, and that the truth he represented couldn't be judged by a Supreme Court or a Roman governor. I believe that they experienced his living presence among them and that they were willing to follow then in his example, even if keeping the message alive led to their own deaths. They refused to cower in the face of Rome and their crosses and their tombs. I believe that the resurrection means that even if you kill Jesus, the gospel is still preached. Even if you kill Gandhi, if you murder Martin Luther King, if you imprison Nelson Mandela, there are things that prisons and graves cannot hold. I believe that the meaning of the resurrection is that you, the faith community, still stand up to the empire. You still refuse to bow before their crosses, their prisons, and their tombs. And even though the arc of time is long, we will bend it towards justice, even if we have to use our own flesh and our own blood to do the job. 2 weeks before he was assassinated, El Salvador's Archbishop, Oscar Romero, said in a radio broadcast, "I have often been threatened with death, but if they kill me, I will arise in the Salvadoran people. If the threat comes to be fulfilled from this moment, I offer my blood to God for the redemption and the resurrection of El Salvador. Let my blood be the seed of freedom and the sign that hope will continue." That's what resurrection means. Turning Jesus into a God whose relevance is confined to some pie-in-the-sky hope of going to heaven when you die is, in my opinion, just another way of stuffing him back into the tomb to shut him up. But we're done with that stuff. His blood, like the blood of the prophets who came before him and the saints who have followed him, now runs in your veins. You are the resurrection. You are the prophets. You are the apostles and saints. And some of you figuratively And it wouldn't be a shock if some of us literally become martyrs who make resurrection real. And so we rise to defend the people rejected by organized religion. We have risked our good names and our reputations and our careers to defend those the world would have abused. And this year, we will see resurrection. We will see substantial victory in some areas, and in others, we must remain vigilant, resolved, and very, very loud to avoid tragic decisions in other areas. Though we mean different things when we say it, I would like to add my voice to the liturgical expression of the church through the centuries. He is not dead. He is risen. I know because I see him among you.
Amen.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverend.ray@aol.com for more information.